I changed the profession, the symbolic object, the family setup, daughter as the entitled one this time, since the analysis flagged that reversal is underused, the city, quote, the mechanism of protection, and gave a firmer, more visible consequence at the end, per the comment feedback, while keeping the calm narrator voice, the trust before invasion structure, and the dialogue-driven confrontation beats. My daughter had my wedding ring resized to fit her own finger while I was still in the recovery ward at St. Luke's, 3 hours after quadruple bypass surgery, and she did not ask me first. She did not ask me after either. I found out the way I found out most things that year, by noticing an absence before I noticed anything else. The ring had been Margaret's mother's ring before it was Margaret's, a thin gold band with a single worn sapphire that had sat in my top dresser drawer since the funeral, wrapped in a handkerchief, because I could not bring myself to wear it, and could not bring myself to put it anywhere else. When I came home from the hospital on a gray Tuesday in March, moving slow, careful with the incision, my son-in-law carrying my bag because I was not supposed to lift anything for 6 weeks, I went to that drawer out of habit, the way you check a door is locked even when you know it is. The handkerchief was still there. The ring was not. I did not say anything that first night. I am not a man who says things before I understand them fully. I am a furniture maker. I have spent 41 years building things that have to hold weight for decades without anyone checking the joinery, which means you learn early that the strength of a thing is never in what you can see. You learn to test before you trust. So I said nothing. I ate the dinner my daughter had made, thanked her for it, went to bed early, because the surgeon had told me exhaustion would come in waves for weeks, and I lay there in the dark thinking about a sapphire ring and a woman who had been dead 4 years, and a daughter who had never once, in 36 years, asked to wear her grandmother's ring while her mother was alive to say yes or no. By the following Thursday, I had made 1 phone call. By the following month, my daughter and her husband were the ones scrambling to find somewhere else to live. This is that story, and there are things I need you to understand about me before I tell it, because a man's character is the only context that makes his choices make sense. My name is Walter Kessler. I am 66 years old. I have lived in Asheville, North Carolina for 38 years, in the same house on Sourwood Lane that I built the frame of with my own hands in 1988. And I want to tell you up front that I am not a man who acts from anger. I am a man who acts from measurement. 41 years in a woodshop teaches you that anger warps a joint before it ever cuts through anything useful. What my daughter did not understand, what she could not have understood, standing in my house going through my dresser drawers while I lay sedated on a hospital bed, was that I had been watching the shape of things for the better part of a year, and I had already built the frame that would hold what was coming. My father ran a small hardware store on Merriman Avenue for 34 years. The kind of place where he knew which customers were good for credit and which ones needed to pay cash, and he never once wrote it down anywhere. He just knew, the way you know the grain of a piece of oak by running your thumb across it. He didn't leave me money. He left me a habit of paying close attention to what people did rather than what they said, and an old workbench that I still use today, scarred in places from tools he'd been using since before I was born. I apprenticed under a cabinet maker named Otis Hargrove, starting at 19. Learned the trade for 6 years, and in 1983, I opened my own shop, Kessler Fine Woodworking, in a rented space off Charlotte Street with $300 of tools and a waiting list of exactly 1 customer, my father's old barber, who wanted a hutch built for his wife. By 1991, I had 2 employees. By 2003, 6, and a reputation among the estate lawyers and interior designers in 3 counties as the man you called when something needed to be built correctly and would need to last past your own lifetime. I sold the retail side of the business in 2019, kept the custom commission work for myself because I am not built for retirement, not fully, and I still take 2 or 3 projects a year, mostly because Margaret used to say that a man who stops making things starts disappearing a little at a time, and I did not want to disappear. I bought the lot on Sourwood Lane in 1987 for almost nothing because the land was steep and nobody wanted to build on it. Margaret was the one who saw what I could not. She stood at the top of that slope looking down through the trees toward the ridgeline and said, "This is where the kitchen window goes, right here, so that whoever is standing at the sink in the morning is looking at the mountains and not at a wall." I built that kitchen around her window. She stood at that sink for 31 years watching the light change on Elk Mountain across the valley, and she kept a small green notebook in a drawer by the stove where she wrote down things worth remembering, recipes and bird sightings and things I had said at dinner that she wanted to keep, the same way some women keep photographs. Margaret was a hospice nurse for 26 years, which meant she understood the exact weight of things ending long before I did, and when she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the fall of 2020, she did not fall apart, she made lists. She made sure I knew where the deed to the property was filed and which drawer held the insurance paperwork and which neighbor to call if the well pump ever failed again like it had in 2011. She died in April of 2021, 7 weeks after her 63rd birthday, in the bedroom of the house on Sourwood Lane, with the window she had chosen open to spring air, and both of our children in the room, and my hand wrapped around hers. The house was different after that. Not empty. Different. The way a piece of furniture is different once you remove the one joint that everything else was quietly depending on. It still stands. It just stands differently. My daughter Vanessa was 34 when her mother died. Married 8 years to a man named Curtis Ambrose, who worked in commercial insurance underwriting and had a way of describing his own ambitions as things that were happening to him rather than things he was doing, as though success were weather. They had one son, Eli, 11 years old, sweet and quiet in the way children get when they've absorbed more of their parents' tension than anyone realizes. Vanessa had grown up comfortable in a way that had never quite cost her anything, and there is a particular confidence that comes from proximity to a life you did not build yourself, a confidence with no floor under it. She had worked briefly as a marketing coordinator before Eli was born and had not gone back, and money had been a low, persistent undertone in every conversation we'd had for the better part of 3 years, framed always as concern rather than want. My son Theodore was different. 31, living in Chattanooga where he ran a small structural engineering consultancy he had built from nothing, after I made it clear early on that the woodshop was not an inheritance, it was an example. He called on Sundays without needing a reminder and drove up twice that first winter after Margaret died just to sit with me on the porch and not talk about anything in particular, which is its own kind of care. I started noticing the shape of what was coming in the summer of 2022. Small things, the way you first notice a hairline crack in a tabletop, not as a crack yet, just a difference in how the light catches the surface. Vanessa mentioned at a 4th of July gathering what the Sourwood Lane property would likely appraise for given how the neighborhood had developed. Curtis asked, almost idly, whether I had thought about right-sizing, his word, given that the house was a lot of square footage for one person. There was a conversation, framed as concern, about whether I should have someone checking in on me more regularly given my age and, delicately, given everything with the heart that ran in the family. Since my own father had died of a coronary event at 71, I did not react to any of it in the moment. I am a craftsman. You do not respond to the first sign of stress in a material. You observe it, you note where it appeared and under what pressure, and you wait to see whether the pattern repeats before you decide what it means. It repeated in September, when Vanessa called on a Wednesday evening, not our usual Sunday, and asked whether my will was current, whether I'd thought about what would happen to the house, whether I'd considered talking to an elder law attorney she knew of, a friend, very reasonable rates. I thanked her. I told her everything was handled. I said nothing further. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table under Margaret's window and thought about what she would have said if she'd been alive to hear that call. She would have said, "Walter, you know exactly what that was." I did know. The only question was what to do about it while there was still time to do something quiet. My attorney is a woman named Rosalind Pruitt, 51 years old, an estate and elder law practice on Patton Avenue downtown. A woman who has the particular gift of telling you the truth about your situation instead of the version of the truth you'd prefer. I had used her to handle the transfer of the shop's retail assets in 2019 and trusted her the way you trust a level, because she does not bend to make you feel better. I called her on a Friday morning in October of 2022 and told her what I had been observing for 4 months. The appraisal comment, the right-sizing comment, the concern about my heart, the sudden interest in my will delivered on a weeknight instead of a Sunday. I told her I was 65 at the time, that the Sourwood Lane property was worth somewhere north of $590,000 given how the Asheville market had moved, that I had a modest retirement account and continuing income from commission work, and that my daughter had recently become extremely interested in the future of all three. Rosalind listened without interrupting, the way she always does, and when I finished, she asked me one question. "What do you want to happen to what you built?" I told her I wanted it to go where I decided it should go, on my own timeline, Not on a timeline someone else had quietly started running without telling me. She told me to come in the following week and bring every document I owned. What followed was a 2-hour meeting in which Rosalind reviewed the deed, the will as it existed, my retirement paperwork, and then set it all down and looked at me directly. She said the house was the vulnerable piece, held solely in my name, which made it the single asset most exposed if anyone ever tried to argue I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, particularly given my cardiac history. She recommended a revocable living trust, myself as trustee while I remained competent, a successor trustee with no personal stake in the outcome, and a named beneficiary. I asked who should be successor trustee. She said someone who would not flinch under family pressure. I said her name. She told me that was not a small responsibility to accept. I told her I understood that, and that it was exactly why I was asking her and not a family member. She agreed to it in writing the following week. We filed the paperwork over the following 2 months. The Margaret and Walter Kessler Family Trust was established in January of 2023. The Sourwood Lane house transferred into the trust that same month. Theodore was named residential beneficiary. Rosalind became successor trustee. When Vanessa called in February, warm and casual, to ask whether I'd given any more thought to the estate planning conversation, the house she was thinking about had already been legally restructured for 6 weeks. I told her I'd taken care of it. She said that was great to hear, Dad, really. I told her I had always been a careful man. She laughed and asked about Eli's school play and then had somewhere to be. The heart was the thing that finally forced the issue. I had been managing an arrhythmia and progressive blockage since 2020, medicated and monitored, until my cardiologist, a measured and unhurried man named Dr. Osei, told me in December of 2023 that medication had run its course and that I needed a quadruple bypass, scheduled, not emergency, which he considered the better kind of frightening. We set the date for early March. Theodore wanted to drive up from Chattanooga for the surgery, and I told him it wasn't necessary. He said he had already requested the time off. I told Vanessa on a Sunday call, and she expressed concern with an efficiency that moved past the concern itself almost before it had finished being said and pivoted immediately to logistics. She said she and Curtis had been talking and felt strongly that the most sensible thing would be for them to stay at the house during my recovery, given the size of the place and the seriousness of the surgery. I told her I appreciated the offer, that Theodore was coming, that I had a home health aide arranged through the hospital's cardiac recovery program, that it was handled. She called back 4 days later, said she'd been thinking about it more and felt even more strongly, said a house that size with one recovering person in it wasn't a safe situation, said Curtis's mother could help with Eli so that she and Curtis could focus entirely on me, said she'd already started looking into what moving in temporarily would involve. She had already started looking into the logistics of moving into my house before I had said yes to any of it. I called Rosalind the next morning and told her about the second call. She said she wanted to suggest something in addition to the trust structure, a layer of documentation. She asked whether I had a home security system. I told her I had a basic alarm. She recommended interior cameras, cloud-recorded, 60-day rolling archive, placed in the common areas, mounted flush and unobtrusive. I asked her why she felt that specific about it. She said that if someone intended to make a move on my home and my capacity, they would say things inside that house they would never put in writing, and she wanted those things recorded, time-stamped, and admissible if it ever came to that. I ordered the system that same afternoon. My neighbor Dale Prentice, who had lived 2 lots down from me for 19 years, and whose judgment I had trusted since the well pump failure in 2011, came over on a Saturday and helped me mount 4 cameras: the kitchen, the living room, the front hallway, and the hall outside the master bedroom, all recording continuously to cloud storage. Dale asked, while we were finishing the last one, whether I was sure I wanted to go this far. I told him I was sure about all of it except my own heart. He laughed, and then he said, "Walter, you call me before you call anyone but Rosalind if this goes sideways." I told him I would. The surgery was scheduled for March 4th. Theodore arrived the night before, and we had dinner at a barbecue place on Riverside Drive that Margaret had loved. Ordered what she always ordered, and did not discuss the surgery or Vanessa or any of it, which was exactly what I needed that night. I checked in at St. Luke's at 6 in the morning. Dr. Osei performed the bypass at 9. Theodore was there when I came around, groggy and slow, and he stayed 4 days before he had to get back to his own consultancy, making me promise 3 separate times in the hospital corridor that I would call the moment anything felt wrong. I watched him walk toward the elevator and felt the particular kind of pride that comes from watching a child become exactly the adult you had hoped for without your having had to say much about it along the way. What I did not know, watching him go, was that on the evening of March 6th, Vanessa and Curtis had arrived at my house with 2 suitcases, several boxes, and Curtis's mother, a woman I had met perhaps 5 times in 8 years, and that they had begun, room by room, repositioning my life around their own. What I did not know was that on the morning of March 7th, while I lay recovering 4 floors up with tubes in my chest, my daughter had opened my dresser drawer, unwrapped her grandmother's ring from the handkerchief where it had sat untouched for 4 years, and taken it to a jeweler on Haywood Street to have it resized to fit her own hand. What I did not know was that over the following 9 days, while I worked through cardiac rehabilitation and the slow, humbling process of relearning how to breathe deeply without pain, my daughter and her husband had systematically remade my house into theirs. My study became Curtis's home office. My workshop tools were boxed and stacked in the garage to make room for what Curtis called a proper gym setup. Margaret's reading chair was moved out of the bedroom entirely, and the master bedroom, my room, Margaret's room, the room with the window she had chosen looking out toward Elk Mountain, became Vanessa and Curtis's. I want to describe what it was like standing in my own driveway that Tuesday, because it matters. I felt several things very quickly, and then every one of them went quiet. Not suppressed. Quiet. The way a shop floor goes silent. When you catch a serious flaw in a piece of lumber mid-cut, and you stop the saw before it becomes a mistake you cannot undo. What replaced the feeling was a clear, working sequence of thought. I had built the trust. I had installed the cameras. I had told Rosalind exactly what I suspected was coming, and she had told me precisely what to do the moment it arrived. It had arrived. I walked inside slowly, careful with my chest, and found the living room rearranged. Margaret's reading chair gone from where it had always sat by the window. My bedroom door was closed. I could hear a television through it. I did not open it. I went instead to the hall bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and called Rosalind. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I was home and that they had moved in. All of them. She asked. All of them. I told her Vanessa, Curtis's mother, and that I believed Vanessa and Curtis were sleeping in my bedroom. Rosalind told me to do one very specific thing that night: go to the kitchen, sit down, say nothing to either of them about anything being wrong, and let the evening pass exactly as though I had noticed nothing. She reminded me that as of that moment, the trust was fully in effect. The cameras had been recording every day since January, and everything that had happened in my house during my recovery was already time-stamped, already stored, already ours. Vanessa came into the kitchen a little after 6 that evening and asked how I was feeling, whether I needed anything. Said they'd all been so worried. I told her I was managing. She said they'd felt strongly that I shouldn't be alone, that the kids loved having more room, that it just made sense given everything. I told her it was a great deal to process after 9 days in the hospital and that I was going to bed early, and I went to the guest room and lay awake a long time, not thinking about Vanessa at all, thinking instead about Thursday. Rosalind's message came that night with a single name and a downtown address. 9 in the morning, bring nothing but myself. I was there at 8:50. Marcus Boone was a 59-year-old process server with a quiet, unremarkable manner and 20 years of experience in Buncombe County, and he asked me directly whether my daughter's name appeared on any deed or mortgage document for the property. I told him no. He asked whether the property was held in trust. I told him since January of the previous year. He nodded the way a man nods when a diagnosis confirms what he already suspected. He told me that Thursday morning at 8 he would knock on my door, hand whoever answered a notice to vacate, and that they would have 48 hours to remove themselves and their belongings, after which, if they had not complied, we would move to an unlawful detainer filing through district court, and the sheriff's office would handle enforcement. He told me it rarely went that far, because most people, once they understand the paperwork in front of them, prefer to avoid the alternative. I asked him why he thought that. He said because people don't like the sheriff showing up at a house with their children inside it. He looked at me for a moment and told me I seemed remarkably calm for a man in my position. I told him I had been dealing with this quietly for over a year, and Thursday was simply the part that finally became visible. That evening I opened the camera archive for the first time since coming home. What I found was not merely upsetting, it was categorically worse than I had prepared myself for. Footage from March 6th showed Vanessa and Curtis arriving with boxes, Curtis's mother carrying in a slow cooker and surveying my living room with the proprietary air of someone evaluating a space she had already decided was partly hers. I watched footage from the morning of March 7th, my dresser drawer opening, the handkerchief being unfolded, the ring lifted out and turned once in the light before being pocketed. I paused there for a long moment, breathed, and continued. That evening's footage showed Vanessa and Curtis in the kitchen, Curtis pouring himself a glass of my bourbon, Vanessa at the counter. I turned the audio up. Curtis said he'd checked. Recovery from that kind of surgery typically ran 6 to 8 weeks minimum, and that gave them plenty of time to establish, in his words, a documented pattern of care. Vanessa asked what he meant by documented pattern. Curtis said that with his cardiac history and his age, there would eventually be a conversation with his doctor about whether independent living still made sense, and if they had been the ones here managing things day to day, they would be the natural people positioned to make that case. Vanessa asked about the house, specifically. Curtis said the house was the asset that mattered most, and that whoever was managing his affairs by that point would have, his words exactly, considerable say in what happened to it. I sat in my garage among my own boxed tools and listened to my son-in-law describe a plan for the last years of my life, assembled while I was sedated in a recovery ward, treating me as a problem with a timeline rather than a person with a heartbeat that had just been surgically repaired. I called Rosalind and played her the recording over the phone. She was quiet for several seconds after it ended, and then she told me that language about establishing a documented pattern of care and having considerable say over the property could constitute evidence of an intent to exert undue influence over an elderly relative's estate, which was something the North Carolina Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Division, along with Adult Protective Services, took seriously. She asked whether I wanted to pursue that. I told her I wanted to do this in the right order, that we should get them out of the house first and decide what to do with the rest afterward. She agreed that was more than reasonable and told me to upload the full archive to her secure server that night, which I did. 118 gigabytes of time-stamped footage, encrypted, sent with the access credentials attached. Curtis found me eating breakfast the next morning and asked how I'd slept, said they were thinking of setting up a small home gym in the garage since I wasn't supposed to be lifting anything for weeks anyway. No rush, just while they were here. I told him that sounded like something to discuss. He said, of course, no pressure at all. I finished my coffee, washed my own dish, and drove to Rosalind's office that afternoon to sign the notice. Formally executed, notarized, specific about the trust's ownership, specific about Curtis and Vanessa's complete absence of legal interest in the property, specific about the 48-hour window. Marcus reviewed the signed paperwork and told me he'd see me Thursday at 8. I told him I'd be in the garage. At 8:04 Thursday morning, I heard the knock. A pause, then another knock, then footsteps from the master bedroom, my son-in-law's voice, sleep rough, the voice of a man expecting no one, the front door opening, and then a silence unlike any other silence in that house, the particular kind that happens when the small, ordinary sounds a body makes simply stop all at once. I heard Marcus's voice, flat and procedural. Mr. Ambrose, my name is Marcus Boone. I'm serving you notice to vacate this property on behalf of the trustee of the Kessler Family Trust, legal holder of title. You have 48 hours to vacate and remove all personal property. Full details and consequences of non-compliance are included in this notice. Any questions? A long pause. Then Curtis's voice, stripped entirely of the smooth, efficient warmth he usually wore like a jacket, raw and confused in a way I had never once heard from him in 8 years. What is this? What does this mean? Marcus told him the property was held in trust, that he had no legal interest in it, that he was residing there without the trustee's consent, and that the notice gave him 48 hours. Curtis said his father-in-law lived there, that they were there helping him recover. Marcus told him the trustee's name and contact information were included in the packet and wished him a good morning. The door closed. I sat at my workbench in the garage among boxed hand tools I had used for 4 decades and thought about load distribution, about the exact moment a structure that has been quietly failing finally announces itself. Curtis came into the kitchen 11 minutes later, holding the notice in both hands, the way you hold a document while hoping a second reading will change what it says. He set it down and asked what I had done. I told him I had established a living trust in January of the previous year, that the house had transferred into it at the same time, that Rosalind Pruitt was successor trustee, and that Theodore was residential beneficiary. He stared at me, working backward through every Sunday call and every gentle comment about my heart and my age, watching the whole shape of his own plan collapse against a fact that had already existed for over a year before he'd ever moved a single box into my house. He said I had done this on purpose. I told him I had done it to protect what I had spent 41 years building. He said I had done it because I knew what they were planning. I told him I had done it because I am a craftsman, and a craftsman accounts for the load a structure will eventually have to bear before that load ever arrives. Vanessa came in while he was still holding the paper, and I looked at her and asked her one question before either of them said anything else. I asked her where her grandmother's ring was. She went very still. I told her I had noticed it missing the first night I came home, and that I had said nothing because I wanted to understand the whole shape of things before I said anything at all. She said it was just sitting in a drawer, that no one was wearing it, that she'd only had it resized because she'd always loved it and thought I wouldn't mind. I told her that her mother had left specific instructions, in writing, in a small green notebook that Rosalind still had a copy of, about where every piece of her jewelry was meant to go, and that the ring had never been meant for a drawer she opened without asking, and it had certainly never been meant for her hand while I was still using it as the last physical thing I had of her mother's touch. Vanessa began to cry, and for the first time in the whole conversation, I believed it was not strategic. I called Rosalind that afternoon and told her what had happened with the ring, and she told me something else the footage had picked up 2 nights before the notice was served, a phone conversation Curtis had believed private, in which he discussed retaining a physician contact of his who specialized, in Curtis's words, in cases where family capacity assessments needed a favorable outcome, and referenced a durable power of attorney document he claimed already existed with my signature on it. I told her I had never signed any such document in my life. She told me that if a fraudulent power of attorney did exist bearing an imitation of my signature, that moved this out of the realm of a family property dispute and into the realm of elder financial exploitation, which North Carolina law treats as a felony, and which the Attorney General's Office and Adult Protective Services actively investigate. She asked how I wanted to proceed. I told her to send a formal letter first, not a criminal referral, stating plainly that the trust had reviewed the full archive, that certain concerning conversations had been identified and preserved, that no report had yet been filed with authorities, and that this restraint was contingent on full and immediate surrender of any document purporting to carry my signature within 5 business days. The letter went out on a Thursday. The following Wednesday, a sealed envelope arrived at Rosalind's office by courier. Inside was a power of attorney document. My name signed at the bottom in a hand close enough to convince a stranger and wrong enough for anyone who has watched me sign a receipt for 4 decades to know instantly it was not mine. Notarized by a notary whose license the North Carolina Secretary of State's office opened a formal inquiry into within the month, once Rosalind forwarded the document with her own findings attached. I did not stop there this time. I want to be honest about that, because a man who builds things for a living learns that some flaws cannot simply be sanded down and left. Some flaws have to be reported so the next person who relies on that structure isn't the one who discovers it's failed. Rosalind filed a formal report with Adult Protective Services and referred the forged document to the district attorney's office. Curtis was interviewed twice. I do not know, as I tell you this, whether charges will ultimately be filed. Criminal proceedings move slowly, and I have learned not to hold my breath waiting on institutions to match the pace of my own patience. But the document exists, the footage exists, and the referral exists, and none of it can quietly disappear the way Curtis had clearly hoped his plan would once it succeeded. Vanessa and Curtis moved out over the following week, and it was not a graceful departure. Curtis carried boxes to the car with the stiff, wounded dignity of a man who still believed, somewhere underneath everything, that he had simply been unlucky rather than caught. By the following Friday, the house was mine again in every sense. I found the ring in the top drawer of my dresser 2 days after they left, returned without a note, the resizing left uncorrected, a thin gap of new gold soldered in to make it fit a hand it was never meant for. I took it to a jeweler on Wall Street who had done work for me before, and asked him to restore it as close to its original size as the metal would allow. He told me it would never be exactly the same, that once you alter gold like that you can approximate the original shape but the metal remembers being stretched. I told him that was all right. I understood something about materials remembering what had been done to them. Dale came by that Friday evening and sat with me on the porch a long while, not saying much, because he understands that some things don't need commentary laid over them. At one point he asked what Margaret would have said about all of it. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told him she would have called it a structural failure that had been building for years before anyone noticed the crack, and that she would not have been surprised, only sad and precise about it, the way she was precise about everything. Dale nodded and said that sounded about right. If you have built something with 40 years of your own hands and your own name, and you have felt someone standing near it, waiting for the moment you are too weak to notice what they are quietly taking, I want you to understand that patience is not the same thing as permission, and stillness is not the same thing as surrender. I did not raise my voice one time through any of this. I did not need to. A well-built structure does not announce its strength. It simply holds when the weight finally arrives, and everyone standing near it in that moment understands exactly what they are looking at. Theodore calls every Sunday, same as always, and drives up more than he used to, and we have fallen into a rhythm on Saturday mornings. Coffee on the porch looking out at Elk Mountain through Margaret's window, that feels like something that should have started sooner than it did. The rows of Sharon along the back fence, the one Margaret planted the year we finished the porch, bloomed early again this year. I sat with my coffee and watched the light move across the kitchen counter the way it always has, the way she chose it to, and I understood, the way you understand a joint that has finally been cut correctly after years of almost getting it right, that everything I built is still exactly where I put it, and that some men spend their whole lives building the kind of thing that only reveals what it's truly made of the one time it's tested. I built mine to be tested. When the day came, it held.